If you look at old footage of Vietnam, you'll see the doors of the Huey wide open and, more often than not, a soldier perched in that open doorway with both hands locked around the grip of a machine gun. The rotor wash rips at his uniform. The jungle slides by 100 feet below. He's scanning, always scanning, and sometimes he opens fire. Long, burning arcs of tracer rounds pouring down into the tree line. And then it stops, and he goes back to scanning. They looked calm on camera, composed, almost bored, but if you looked closely at their eyes, you'd see it. That particular hollowness that comes to a man who has stared into the worst of what combat can produce and somehow found a way to keep functioning. These men were called door gunners, and their job was one of the most brutally exposed, psychologically destructive, and statistically lethal assignments in the entire Vietnam War. They were the ones who held the helicopter's firepower pointed at the ground. They were the ones hanging out of the doorway on nothing but a strap when the aircraft banked hard. They were the ones enemy riflemen, machine gunners, and RPG teams were specifically trained to kill first, because everybody on the battlefield understood that silencing the door gunner was the fastest way to neutralize a helicopter's ability to fight back. We're going to go through everything: their lives, their weapons, their training, the horrifying reality of what their missions actually looked like up close, and the terrible psychological weight they carried, not just during the war, but for decades after it ended. Some of what you're about to hear is genuinely hard to sit with. Not in a sensational way, but in the way that real history delivered honestly tends to be. These men deserve that honesty. Now, to understand the door gunner, you first have to understand the machine he rode in. And to understand that machine, you have to go further back than most people expect. All the way back to before Vietnam, before Korea, to the earliest and most primitive days of the military helicopter, when the idea of putting a man with a gun in a spinning winged aircraft was so foreign that most serious military planners actively dismissed it as impractical. The helicopter itself is one of those technologies that has been dreamed about for centuries, but only became real in the 20th century. Leonardo da Vinci sketched a spiral-shaped aerial screw as far back as 1489, and dozens of inventors across the 1800s and early 1900s experimented with rotor-driven flying machines, with results that range from underwhelming to genuinely dangerous. The fundamental engineering challenge was enormous. A rotor generating enough lift to raise a vehicle off the ground also generates enormous torque that would spin the fuselage in the opposite direction unless something counteracted it. This is why virtually every successful helicopter design eventually incorporated a tail rotor, a small secondary rotor mounted vertically at the tail to counter the torque of the main rotor and give the pilot directional control. Solving that problem took decades. The man who finally cracked it in a practical, production-worthy way was Igor Sikorsky, a Russian-born aeronautical engineer who had already designed multi-engine fixed-wing aircraft back in Russia before the revolution drove him to emigrate to the United States in 1919. By 1939, working out of Bridgeport, Connecticut, Sikorsky had built and successfully flown his VS-300, an experimental helicopter with a single main rotor and a tail rotor configuration that would become the standard template for nearly every military helicopter built in the decades that followed. By 1942, the United States Army had contracted with Sikorsky to produce the R-4, a two-seat helicopter that was the world's first mass-produced rotary wing aircraft. It was small, absurdly small by later standards, with a 38-foot diameter main rotor, a 165-horsepower Warner R550 radial engine, a maximum speed of about 75 miles per hour, and a service ceiling of around 8,000 feet. It could carry exactly 2 people, the pilot and 1 passenger. That was it. The entire useful payload was essentially a single human body in addition to the man flying it. The military did find some uses for the R-4 toward the end of World War II. In April 1944, Lieutenant Carter Harmon of the 1st Air Commando Group flew 4 separate rescue missions in a Sikorsky R-4 deep into the jungles of Burma to recover downed Allied airmen from behind Japanese lines, making him arguably the first combat rescue pilot in helicopter history. In the Philippines, in the Aleutians, in a handful of other scattered theatres, R-4s performed occasional medevac pickups and liaison flights that fixed-wing aircraft simply couldn't accomplish in the terrain. But these were curiosities, experimental, isolated, interesting, but strategically inconsequential. The Army and Army Air Forces looked at these fragile, slow, tiny machines and saw a novelty, not a weapon. Their range was pathetic, their payload was almost nothing, their reliability was marginal, and their vulnerability to even light small arms fire was obvious. Put simply, nobody in 1945 was imagining the Huey. What changed everything was Korea. The Korean War, which began in June 1950 and ground on in brutal, grinding fashion until the armistice of July 1953, was the laboratory in which military helicopter doctrine was actually built from scratch through painful trial and error in real combat conditions. By 1950, helicopter technology had advanced meaningfully. The Bell H-13 Sioux, made famous by the television series MASH as the bubble-canopied bird carrying wounded men strapped to stretcher pods on either side of the fuselage, was by this point a reliable, tested machine that could carry pilot and passenger with enough fuel for a reasonable operational radius. The Hiller OH-23 Raven was another design in wide use, similarly configured, similarly capable. Neither of these was a war machine, neither of them had any weapons mounting, any armoured protection, or any meaningful combat capacity. But they could get into places that no fixed-wing aircraft could reach, and in the mountainous, roadless terrain of the Korean peninsula, where a wounded man could be half a day's carry from the nearest road, that was worth more than anyone had initially calculated. The medical evacuation mission, the medevac, became the helicopter's first definitive combat role. It's difficult to quantify with precision, but the best estimates suggest that helicopters evacuated somewhere in the neighborhood of 17,000 wounded American soldiers during the Korean War. The mortality rate among wounded soldiers who were evacuated by helicopter was dramatically lower than for those who had to be moved by ground vehicle or stretcher, simply because speed of treatment is everything in trauma surgery. A man who reaches a MASH unit 20 minutes after being shot survives injuries that would have been fatal if he arrived 2 hours later on the back of a jeep. The numbers bore this out decisively, and the military medical establishment took note. But the Korean War also revealed something else about helicopters, something with more militarily aggressive implications. As the machines got slightly larger and more capable, units began experimenting with other uses. They moved urgent supplies to isolated positions. They shuttled company commanders between units. They inserted and extracted small reconnaissance teams. And inevitably, some enterprising soldiers started firing personal weapons out of the open sides of helicopters during these missions, discovering that a helicopter could provide something no fixed-wing aircraft easily could: hovering, loitering fire support that could be directed with precision at targets in extremely close proximity to friendly troops. The vulnerability problem, though, was just as real in Korea as it had been in World War II. A helicopter flying at low altitude over a hostile area was a target that even a modestly armed and trained rifleman had a reasonable chance of hitting. Rifle rounds, ordinary 7.62 by 39mm AK rounds, .30 caliber rounds from the Chinese and North Korean infantry, could punch through the thin aluminum skin of a helicopter without much difficulty and find something essential to damage. An oil line, a fuel line, a hydraulic actuator, the tail rotor drive shaft. Several helicopters were brought down by small arms fire in Korea, and the lesson was stark and troubling. The helicopter was profoundly useful but profoundly fragile, and nobody had figured out yet how to reconcile those two facts in a way that made the machine into a true weapon of war, rather than just a useful transport. The Army spent much of the late 1950s wrestling with this problem. The solution, when it finally arrived, came from two directions simultaneously. The first was technological. Engineers and designers began working on a new generation of turbine-powered helicopters that were faster, stronger, more reliable, and capable of carrying meaningfully heavier payloads than the piston-engine machines of the Korean War era. The second direction was doctrinal. A growing faction within the Army began seriously arguing that the helicopter shouldn't just be a transport. It should be an assault weapon, an airborne cavalry platform that could transform ground warfare as profoundly as the tank had transformed it in World War I. The man most associated with this doctrinal shift in the American military context was General James Gavin, who had commanded the 82nd Airborne Division during World War II and who, in a famous 1954 article in Harper's Magazine, argued that the helicopter represented the future of cavalry, a way to put fast, mobile, hard-hitting forces exactly where they were needed on a battlefield without being constrained by roads, terrain, or the pace of marching infantry. Gavin called them sky cavalry, and while the idea was initially treated with skepticism, bordering on dismissal by much of the army establishment, it gradually gathered supporters, proponents, and eventually institutional momentum. By 1962, the Army had established a formal test structure for this concept, convening what became known as the Howze Board, named after Lieutenant General Hamilton Howze, who chaired it, to evaluate the potential of airmobile warfare in systematic, rigorous terms. The Howze Board's conclusions were sweeping and enthusiastic. They recommended the creation of entire airmobile divisions, units built around the helicopter as the primary means of tactical movement and combat power projection. Not everyone agreed. Air Force leadership was deeply hostile to the concept, partly for genuine doctrinal reasons, and partly because they didn't love the idea of the Army having its own substantial fixed-wing and rotary-wing combat aviation assets. But the recommendations gained enough traction to produce a real-world test case. The 11th Air Assault Division, activated in February 1963 at Fort Benning, Georgia, to work out the actual operational details of how an airmobile division would fight. The machine that made all of this possible, the machine that became the definitive symbol of the entire Vietnam War, was the Bell UH-1 Iroquois. Soldiers called it the Huey, a nickname derived from its original Army designation of HU-1 before the designation system was changed to UH-1. The name stuck because it sounded right and it was the kind of name that fit the machine. Unpretentious, rugged, workmanlike. Bell Helicopter began developing the UH-1 in the mid-1950s in response to an Army requirement for a utility helicopter capable of medical evacuation, instrument flight, and general utility operations powered by a turboshaft engine rather than a piston engine. The Lycoming T-53 turboshaft Bell fitted into the prototype, which first flew on October 22, 1956, was a revelation compared to what had come before. Turboshaft engines were lighter, more reliable, delivered more power per pound, and could sustain operation at a much wider range of altitudes and temperatures than piston engines. The Bell HU-1A, as it was initially designated, could carry 4 to 6 passengers in addition to the pilot and co-pilot, cruise at around 130 miles per hour, and operate at altitudes where Korean War-era piston-engined helicopters would have been struggling. The Army placed initial orders almost immediately, and by the early 1960s the Huey was in production and in service, with a series of upgraded variants following in rapid succession. The UH-1B featured a more powerful T-53L 1.3 engine, producing 1,100 shaft horsepower, compared to the 770 shaft horsepower of the original T-53-L-1A, giving it meaningfully improved performance. The UH-1C was a purpose-built gunship variant with an even more powerful engine and no passenger carrying capacity, designed purely to mount weapons and suppress ground fire. The UH-1D and later the UH-1H, the most produced variant, extended the fuselage to increase cabin capacity, allowing up to 11 or 12 combat-loaded troops plus the 2-man crew, making them significantly more effective troop transports. By the time American combat involvement in Vietnam reached its peak in the late 1960s, the Huey was being produced at a rate that would have seemed unimaginable a decade earlier, with over 16,000 of all variants eventually built, making it one of the most produced military aircraft of the entire 20th century. Vietnam itself was the crucible that turned all of these doctrinal concepts, technological developments, and organizational experiments into operational reality. Americans had expected Vietnam to be broadly similar to Korea, a conventional conflict with defined front lines, clear military objectives, and an enemy that fought in recognizable military formations using recognizable military tactics. What they found instead was something fundamentally different. A conflict where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere, where the front line was in every direction at once, where the terrain actively conspired against every piece of conventional military equipment the United States had designed its forces around. The geography of Vietnam was the first shock. The Central Highlands, the coastal deltas, the triple canopy jungle that covered vast swathes of the country. This was not terrain for tanks, not terrain for motorized infantry, not terrain for the kind of sweeping maneuver warfare that American doctrine had been built around since the breakout from Normandy. A tank could get stuck trying to cross a paddy dike. A truck convoy moving through a mountain pass was an ambush waiting for someone to spring it. Artillery was useful but often couldn't be positioned where it was needed, and its rounds couldn't reach through jungle canopy to find targets hidden beneath it. Fixed-wing airstrikes were available and were used in enormous quantities. More bomb tonnage was dropped on Vietnam than in all of World War II combined. But a strike fighter moving at 400 miles per hour couldn't provide the kind of precise, sustained, close-in fire support that infantry needed when the enemy was sometimes only 20 or 30 meters away. The helicopter could do all of these things. It could get into clearings in the jungle where nothing wheeled could go. It could move a rifle company from a base camp to a landing zone 10 kilometers away in the time it would have taken that company to walk 3 kilometers on foot. It could evacuate a wounded man from a firefight directly to a surgical hospital. It could hover over a contact and pour machine gun fire into a tree line with a precision that no artillery or airstrike could approach. And critically, once the army had worked out the organizational structure and tactical doctrine, it could do all of these things on a massive, sustained, coordinated scale. By 1965, when the first major American combat units deployed to Vietnam, the army was operating hundreds of helicopters in country. By 1968, at the peak of the build-up, there were approximately 4,000 Army helicopters operating in South Vietnam at any given time, with a total of around 12,000 individual helicopters eventually deploying over the course of the entire war, a number that staggers the imagination when you consider that no previous conflict in history had used more than a few hundred rotary wing aircraft in any capacity. They became the dominant feature of the American military presence in Vietnam, the image that defined the war in film and photography and veteran memory more than any other piece of equipment. The distinctive thwop, thwop, thwop of a Huey rotor became as recognizable a sound as any in the war, heard by every American soldier who served there, sometimes as a sound of deliverance, and sometimes as a sound that meant the fighting was about to begin. And in the doors of those Hueys, behind machine guns that roared and flickered tracer rounds down into the jungle below, were the door gunners. Now, the door gunner role didn't actually exist as a formal, defined position from the beginning. In the early days of American helicopter operations in Vietnam, the period from roughly 1961 to 1963, when the first military advisors were arriving and the war was still officially somebody else's conflict, the standard helicopter crew consisted of 3 people: the aircraft commander, the co-pilot, and the crew chief. The crew chief was the man responsible for the maintenance and airworthiness of the helicopter, which made him an essential crew member regardless of whether he was carrying a weapon. He knew the machine intimately, could identify and often fix mechanical problems in the field, and was responsible for loading, securing, and unloading whatever cargo or passengers the helicopter was carrying. Because he was already there and already familiar with the helicopter's systems, the crew chief took on the additional duty of manning the left side door gun when the aircraft came under fire or flew into a potentially hostile area. 3-man crew, 1 gun. It worked after a fashion in the relatively low-intensity early advisory period. But as American involvement escalated, as the missions got harder, the landing zones got hotter, and the enemy got more sophisticated in their tactics for attacking helicopters, it became rapidly obvious that 1 gun was not enough. The Viet Cong had adapted their tactics specifically to exploit the helicopter's vulnerabilities. They learned to hold fire and let a helicopter land before opening up from multiple directions simultaneously, so that the aircraft was most exposed, lowest, slowest, most committed. At the moment, they hit it. They concentrated automatic weapons, rocket-propelled grenades, and even anti-aircraft heavy machine guns in areas they knew helicopters would have to use. They understood that the helicopter, for all its power and mobility, had one massive structural vulnerability. If you could make it physically impossible for the aircraft to land or take off safely in a given area, you could effectively neutralize its ability to support ground troops in that area. The response was a 4th crew member, the door gunner, or in the informal language of the period, the shotgun rider. This soldier's job, stripped of any euphemism or tactical jargon, was to hang out of the right side of the helicopter, partially suspended from the aircraft by a nylon strap clipped to a ring on his flight suit that soldiers nicknamed the monkey strap, and put rounds into anything threatening the aircraft or the troops it was inserting or extracting. That was it. That was the entire job description. You hung in the open doorway of a machine flying at 100 feet above the ground, often at 100 miles per hour or faster, with no armor, minimal protection, completely exposed to everything below you, and you fired your machine gun. Even the basic mechanical fact of the job, hanging out of a moving helicopter on a single strap, was terrifying enough before anyone started shooting at you. The rotor wash was constant and disorienting. The noise was tremendous. The helicopter banked and pitched and accelerated in ways that made the open doorway feel like the edge of a cliff that kept moving. The strap itself, for all its practical utility, was a psychological burden. Every time the aircraft rolled or turned sharply, you felt the full weight of gravity pulling you toward the open air, and the only thing between you and a very long fall was a nylon strap rated to a weight limit that some door gunners were genuinely not confident they stayed within. And yes, to answer the question that anyone watching this will already be thinking, yes, door gunners did sometimes fall out of helicopters. Not often, but it happened. A strap that hadn't been properly secured, a particularly violent maneuver, a moment of inattention during a frantic extraction from a hot landing zone. Some who fell were recovered, some were not. The men who took on this assignment were not, as a general rule, the ones who had volunteered for it with full knowledge of what it entailed. Many door gunners arrived at the role through a combination of circumstance and necessity. Some were crew chiefs who took on the gunner role as an additional duty. Some were infantrymen who volunteered or were assigned when units needed the position filled. Some were young enlisted men who found themselves in Vietnam with a military occupational specialty that put them in proximity to aviation units, and who discovered that the job was available and decided, for reasons ranging from patriotism to adventure to simple peer pressure, to take it. The average age of a door gunner in Vietnam was somewhere around 19 or 20 years old. Most of them had been in high school 2 or 3 years earlier. Training for the door gunner role was intensive, but not, by later standards, particularly long. The baseline requirements were weapons proficiency with the M60 machine gun, familiarity with the helicopter's communication systems and intercom equipment, and a working understanding of the tactical procedures that governed how the aircraft and its crew operated in a combat. Environment. Specific topics covered in training included the aircraft intercom system, how to communicate with the pilot and co-pilot through the flight helmet, how to report enemy contacts, how to call out direction using the clock system that aviation crews use to orient threats relative to the nose of the aircraft. 12 o'clock was straight ahead, 3 o'clock was directly to the right, 6 o'clock was directly behind, 9 o'clock was directly to the left. When a door gunner spotted something, muzzle flash in a tree line, figures running across a rice paddy, an RPG team setting up, he called it by clock position and distance instantly. No time for anything more elaborate than that. Gunners were also trained in formation flying procedures, not as pilots, but as crew members who needed to understand the tactical geometry of multi-aircraft formations, so they could protect adjacent aircraft while the formation moved through potentially hostile territory. They learned aircraft loading and unloading procedures, how to secure cargo and troops so that nothing shifted in flight and affected the aircraft's balance, and basic procedures for dealing with mechanical emergencies. And of course, they spent extensive time on the M60 itself, how it functioned, how to maintain it, how to clear jams, how to change the barrel when it overheated, and, crucially, how to actually hit targets from a moving platform in ways that the standard infantry training for the weapon had never fully addressed. That last skill was far harder to acquire than it might sound, and it deserves a detailed explanation because it gets at something fundamental about what made the door gunner's job so technically demanding even before you factored in the enemy shooting back. The M60 machine gun, which we'll cover in exhaustive detail shortly, was designed and optimized for ground use. The marksmanship principles taught to infantry machine gunners were built around the assumption that you, the gunner, were stationary or at most moving slowly, and that your target was somewhere out in front of you at a distance you could estimate reasonably well. Lead the target a bit, fire in short, disciplined bursts, adjust and fire again. The principles were sound, well established, and drilled into every machine gunner who went through infantry training. They were also almost entirely useless if you were hanging out of the side of a helicopter moving at 100 miles per hour. When you fire a weapon from a moving platform, the round doesn't just travel toward where you're pointing, it carries the momentum of the moving platform with it. Fire a round from a helicopter moving forward at 100 miles per hour, and that round has a horizontal velocity component of approximately 147 feet per second in the direction of flight, in addition to whatever velocity the cartridge's propellant imparts to it. If you're shooting at a target off to your left side, the round is still going to drift forward relative to the target because of this carried momentum. At the same time, the target on the ground may itself be moving, in which case you have to lead it the way a hunter leads a flying bird. The helicopter is also constantly changing altitude, speed, and heading, and every change in its flight path changes the angle and direction of your shot. And the wind is always there, at low altitude, potentially gusting and variable, deflecting your rounds unpredictably. And the helicopter's rotor wash creates its own turbulence around the aircraft that adds another layer of ballistic complexity. The practical result of all this was that accurate aimed fire from a helicopter doorway was extraordinarily difficult, and every door gunner eventually learned that in a real combat situation, precision was largely a theoretical concept. What you actually did was fire volume. You swept your gun through arcs of the probable target area. You let the tracers, every fifth round in the standard M60 ammunition loading was a red tracer, tell you where your rounds were actually going, and you adjusted your aim point based on where you saw the impacts relative to where you wanted them. You fired long bursts, not the disciplined 5 to 7 round taps that infantry training recommended, because in the time it took you to evaluate the impact of a short burst and adjust, the helicopter had moved far enough that your entire reference frame had changed. You fired aggressively, continuously, in wide sweeping arcs, covering as much ground as possible with as many rounds as possible, keeping enemy heads down, suppressing fire from multiple positions at once, making it difficult or impossible for anyone on the ground to aim a weapon at your aircraft long enough to take an effective shot. It was a philosophy of firepower that was fundamentally different from anything taught in conventional infantry gunnery, and it took time and actual combat experience to fully internalize. The veterans who did it for months developed an intuitive feel for bullet drop and carry forward that they struggled to articulate verbally but executed almost automatically in the heat of a mission. They read the tracers the way a skilled artillery observer reads the dust plumes of adjusting rounds, constant, rapid, unconscious triangulation between where the bullets were going and where they needed to be. What made all of this simultaneously more impressive and more terrifying was the machine they were doing it with. The M60 General Purpose Machine Gun is a weapon with a complicated legacy. To the infantrymen who carried it through the jungles of Vietnam, it was known as the Pig, a nickname that captured both affection and exasperation in equal measure, because the M60 was simultaneously one of the most effective weapons any squad could have and one of the most burdensome. At 23.15 pounds unloaded, it was heavier than any infantryman wanted to carry through tropical heat and humidity over terrain that could include everything from flooded rice paddies to steep jungle hillsides to open beaches. At a basic combat load of ammunition, 200 rounds for the gunner himself, additional belts distributed among the assistant gunner and ammo bearer, and the weight became genuinely punishing. But nobody in a rifle squad ever complained about having an M60 when the shooting started because the alternative was losing firefights. The M60 was the United States military's answer to a problem that had been identified clearly during World War II. American infantry squads lacked a true general-purpose machine gun capable of providing sustained automatic fire at the squad and platoon level. The weapons the Army had used during the Second World War, the M1918 Browning automatic rifle and the M1919 Browning medium machine gun, were capable tools but had significant limitations in flexibility and portability. The bar was essentially a heavy automatic rifle rather than a true machine gun, feeding from a 20-round detachable box magazine that limited sustained fire capability, and while soldiers loved its reliability and firepower, it wasn't designed to serve as a genuine squad-level fire support weapon. The M1919 was a genuine machine gun capable of sustained fire, but at £31 for the gun alone and requiring a tripod plus a separate ammunition carrier, it was a crew-served weapon that slowed the squad's movement significantly. Meanwhile, the Germans had demonstrated in World War II what a true general-purpose machine gun concept could look like. The MG-34 and MG-42 were versatile, relatively lightweight weapons that could serve equally well in the light bipod-mounted role alongside the infantry, or mounted on a tripod for sustained fire at the company level. The MG-42 in particular, which could fire at a cyclic rate of up to 1,500 rounds per minute in some configurations, had been a devastating tactical asset that American infantry had learned to respect and fear across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and northwestern Europe. The distinctive tearing sound of the MG-42 in full automatic fire was something American veterans described as unforgettable. A sound like tearing canvas or ripping cloth, so fast that individual shots couldn't be distinguished, just a continuous mechanical roar. American weapons developers had taken careful note. After the war, development work began on an American weapon that would combine the firepower and sustained fire capability of the best German designs with American manufacturing standards and the specific requirements of the post-war army. The result, after years of development work that included extensive examination of German-captured weapons, including the FG-42, a sophisticated German airborne rifle that contributed significantly to the M60's bolt and feed system design, was the M60, officially adopted by the Army in 1957. It chambered the 7.62 by 51mm NATO cartridge, a round standardized across NATO forces to ensure interoperability of ammunition, with a bullet that weighed approximately 9.7 grams and left the muzzle at approximately 2,800 feet per second from the M60's 22-inch barrel. At the M60's cyclic rate of fire, which ranged from 500 to 650 rounds per minute, depending on the individual weapon, a 100-round belt of ammunition could be exhausted in approximately 11 seconds. Effective range against area targets, the kind of suppressive fire that keeps the enemy's heads down, was roughly 1,300 meters, or about 1,400 yards. Maximum range for the round itself was over 3,700 meters, though at that distance, accurate aimed fire was essentially theoretical. In Vietnam, the M60 performed a role that no other weapon in the American arsenal could replicate. The dense jungle that covered so much of the country was not only difficult to move through, it actively degraded the effectiveness of most infantry weapons. The M16's 5.56 by 45mm round, which had been developed with the understanding that most infantry firefights occurred at relatively short ranges, and that lighter bullets meant soldiers could carry more ammunition, lost energy and stability when it struck the vegetation. Rounds fired through dense foliage tended to deflect and tumble unpredictably, reducing their effectiveness significantly beyond the first few meters of jungle. The M60's heavier 7.62mm round had substantially better penetrating power through vegetation, which in the context of fighting an enemy who habitually used jungle cover to shield themselves from direct fire was not a minor advantage. The M60 also provided the volume of fire necessary to win the specific kind of firefight that Vietnam most commonly produced. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army ambush tactics were designed to achieve local fire superiority in the first seconds of contact, inflict maximum casualties before the ambushed unit could react, and then break contact before they could be fixed in place and destroyed. The only effective counter to this was to be able to respond with immediate, overwhelming fire volume, to flood the kill zone with so much metal that the ambushers were suppressed before they could inflict their planned casualties. The M60 was the weapon that made this possible at the squad level, because no collection of M16s firing on semi-automatic could produce the same sustained suppressive effect as a single M60 pouring out continuous automatic fire. Gun teams were organised specifically around this tactical requirement. A standard M60 team consisted of 3 men: the gunner, who carried and fired the weapon, the assistant gunner, who carried a spare barrel, a basic load of ammunition, and was prepared to help clear jams, change barrels, or take over the gun if the gunner became a casualty, and the ammo bearer, who carried additional ammunition and whatever other supplies the team needed. In combat terminology, the ammo bearer was called the mule, a nickname that captured perfectly the nature of his contribution to the team's effectiveness. He carried weight. He carried as much weight as he physically could, because the one thing you genuinely never wanted to run out of in the middle of a firefight was ammunition for your machine gun. On a typical patrol mission, the M60 gunner himself might carry 200 rounds. The assistant gunner carried another 200 to 300 rounds plus the spare barrel. The ammo bearer carried as much as he could physically manage, which in practice often meant 300 to 400 rounds or more, plus his own fighting load of personal weapons, water, food, and equipment. In larger operations where sustained combat was expected, entire squads would each carry a 100-round belt of M60 ammunition draped around their necks in addition to their own personal ammunition loads, essentially functioning as distributed ammunition resupply for the machine gun team. Every fifth round in these belts was a tracer, a round fitted with a pyrotechnic compound in its base that burned bright red in flight, allowing the gunner to visually track his round's trajectory and adjust his aim. American forces used red tracers. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army used green ones. In the chaos of a nighttime firefight, the color of the tracers could tell you a great deal about who was shooting at whom from which direction. A grim but useful tactical datum in the darkness and confusion. The M60 had its problems, and veterans were not shy about discussing them. Reliability in the wet, humid, dirty conditions of Vietnam was a constant concern. The weapon had a tendency to jam when contaminated by mud or sand, and in a country where infantrymen spent entire days slogging through flooded rice paddies or crawling through wet jungle, keeping any mechanical weapon clean and functional was a constant struggle. The barrel overheated rapidly under sustained fire. After approximately 200 rounds of continuous automatic fire, the barrel would be too hot to handle without protective gloves and needed to be changed for a cool replacement barrel, a process that the assistant gunner practiced until he could execute it in seconds even under fire. The weapon also had a frustrating tendency to what gunners called running away, a mechanical condition in which the firing mechanism would fail to reset properly and the weapon would continue firing even after the trigger was released, essentially becoming a runaway gun. This was a frightening situation in any context, but particularly in a patrol scenario where the gunner was suddenly firing uncontrollably in a direction that might include friendly soldiers, and where the only way to stop it was to physically wrench the feed belt out of the weapon, while trying not to accidentally angle the barrel toward your own people. Despite these issues, the M60 was deeply trusted. Soldiers who had carried it through multiple firefights developed an intimate familiarity with their individual weapon's specific quirks and tendencies. How much tension to keep on the feed belt, how often to oil the bolt carrier group, which positions caused the most feed problems, and they could often prevent or immediately resolve mechanical issues that would have stopped a less experienced gunner cold. Many M60 gunners practiced disassembly and reassembly of the weapon blindfolded, simulating the nighttime and low visibility conditions that combat frequently produced, some even competing with each other to see who could do it fastest. This wasn't showing off. This was the kind of muscle memory that kept you alive when the weapon jammed in the middle of an ambush and you had approximately 3 seconds to fix it before the situation became unrecoverable. Now, all of that, the M60's history, its design, its tactical role, its operational requirements, its flaws and virtues, applied to every infantry machine gunner in Vietnam. But for the door gunner, there were additional dimensions to the weapon's use that made his relationship with it substantially more complex. The M60 in its ground roll was normally fired from a bipod attached to the barrel, which gave the gunner a stable firing platform and allowed for relatively precise aimed fire over sustained periods. In the helicopter doorway roll, there was no bipod, no stable platform, no possibility of carefully aimed fire at specific targets. Instead, the weapon was typically mounted on one of several configurations: a swivel mount or pentel mount bolted to the helicopter's floor or door frame, which allowed the gun to rotate in a horizontal arc and be elevated or depressed vertically, or a bungee cord suspension system in which the weapon was suspended by a loop of elastic bungee cord attached to a point above the door, allowing the gunner to essentially swing the weapon freely in any direction while the bungee absorbed recoil and prevented the muzzle from climbing uncontrollably. Some gunners preferred the bungee system for its flexibility, particularly for engaging targets rapidly appearing at varying directions and distances. Others preferred the solid feel of a rigid mount that gave them a more predictable reference frame for aiming. In practice, many door gunners had strong opinions about their mounting configuration. and spent time in the maintenance bays, customizing their setup to their personal preference, a level of individualism that would have been unusual in conventional infantry units, but was often tolerated in aviation companies where the human factors of crew performance were well understood. The standard ammunition load for a door gunner varied by mission type and expected threat level, but commonly ranged from 2,000 to 4,000 rounds per mission, depending on what the aircraft could carry without exceeding its weight limits. Those weight limits were a constant practical constraint in a helicopter that was already carrying a full crew, passengers or cargo, fuel, and whatever other equipment was needed for the specific mission. In the hot, high-altitude conditions of the Central Highlands, where the thinner air reduced rotor efficiency, the weight limits were tighter and the trade-offs more painful. Sometimes getting into a landing zone with a full load of troops meant the door gunner went in with less ammunition than he wanted. This was a fact of life that nobody liked and everybody accepted because there was no alternative that didn't involve leaving troops behind. The ammunition management problem was, in fact, one of the most challenging aspects of the door gunner role in sustained operations. A door gunner in a hot landing zone might fire several hundred rounds in the course of a single landing and takeoff sequence lasting 30 to 60 seconds. If the crew was flying multiple sorties in a single day, which was routine, particularly during major operations, the ammunition consumption could be staggering. Resupply between sorties was done quickly, under time pressure, often while the aircraft was being refueled, with the gunner and crew chief working together to load fresh belts into the ammunition cans as fast as they could, while the pilots talked to the Tactical Operations Center about the next mission. There was no leisurely process of careful preparation and checking. You loaded what you could, as fast as you could, and then you went back out. The other primary weapon system available to door gunners, particularly those assigned to gunship aircraft, was the M134 minigun. If the M60 was the workhorse of door gun armament, the M134 was the sledgehammer. The M134 was a 6-barreled rotary machine gun, derived from the M61 Vulcan cannon used in Air Force fighter aircraft, scaled down to fire 7.62 by 51mm NATO rifle rounds rather than the Vulcan's 20mm cannon rounds, with a cyclic rate of fire ranging from 2,000 to 6,000 rounds per minute, depending on the electrical motor setting. That upper rate of 6,000 rounds per minute is a figure that requires a moment of context to appreciate. 6,000 rounds per minute is 100 rounds per second. 100 rounds per second means that a single 2-second burst from a minigun puts 200 rounds into the target area. A sustained 10-second burst delivers more than 1,600 rounds. At its highest rate of fire, the M134 didn't produce the recognizable rat-tat-tat of a conventional machine gun. It produced a sound that veterans consistently described as a continuous roar or buzz, almost electronic in quality, unlike anything conventional small arms produced. The combined effect of 6 rotating barrels cycling through the entire firing sequence 100 times per second created a sound that was its own category of acoustic experience. The minigun was typically mounted in pairs or in combination with other weapons on dedicated gunship variants. The AH-1 Cobra was the purpose-built attack helicopter that eventually replaced the armed UH-1 in the attack role. But during the early years of the war, gunship missions were frequently flown by hog configurations of the UH-1B, fitted with external weapons packages, including miniguns, 2.75-inch folding-fin aerial rockets, and sometimes grenade launchers. The UH-1C, developed specifically for the gunship role, addressed the performance limitations of trying to fly a combat-loaded armoured gunship with the same engine fitted to the troop carrier variants. By equipping it with the more powerful T53-L-13B turboshaft producing 1,400 shaft horsepower, Bell gave the UH-1C the performance margin necessary to manoeuvre aggressively while carrying a full weapons load. But even on gunships, even with miniguns and rockets, there were still door gunners. Men in the doorways with M60s, providing the close-in suppressive fire that the fixed forward-firing weapons couldn't address because they required the entire aircraft to be pointed at the target. When a gunship rolled in on a gun run, its nose-mounted and pylon-mounted weapons were all aimed in the direction the aircraft was flying. Anything that appeared off to the side or behind the aircraft, and in a combat environment with fire coming from multiple directions simultaneously, threats appeared from everywhere, was the door gunner's problem. So now that we understand the weapon and the machine, let's talk about what the actual missions look like from inside the doorway, because that is where the story gets truly dark. The typical door gunner mission in Vietnam fell into several broad categories, each with its own specific demands and its own specific terrors. Troop insertion missions, which pilots called slick missions because the UH-1s used for them had been stripped of the external weapons pods that made gunships look so bristling and angular, were the most common. A slick, typically a UH-1D or H model, would carry 10 to 12 combat-loaded infantry soldiers into a landing zone somewhere in the operational area. The procedure on paper was straightforward. Fly in formation with other slicks and their escorting gunships, approach the landing zone from a direction and altitude chosen to minimize exposure to fire, land, offload the troops, get back in the air, and egress. In practice, everything depended on what the enemy had decided to do with the landing zone. A cold landing zone was one the enemy hadn't fortified, wasn't occupying in force, and chose not to contest. Cold LZ insertions were usually uneventful. You flew in, the troops got off, you left. The door gunners swept their guns back and forth, scanning the tree lines throughout the approach and landing, watching for the first sign of enemy activity, but nothing happened, and you went back to base and did it again. Many missions were cold. Veterans described the boredom of repeated cold LZ operations as its own kind of psychological burden. Not because boredom was a problem in itself, but because the contrast between an uneventful flight and what a hot LZ actually felt like was so extreme that the transition, when it came, was always a shock regardless of how many times you'd been through it. A hot landing zone was something else entirely. This was a landing zone that the enemy had decided to defend, either because they had pre-positioned forces there specifically to ambush inbound helicopters, or because their forces happened to be in the area and chose to engage when they heard the approaching helicopters. Hot LZ insertions were what door gunners spent a significant portion of their psychological energy preparing themselves for, and what veterans with multiple combat tours described as experiences that never became routine regardless of how many times you went through them. The approach to a hot LZ typically began with gunships working the area, making gun runs along the edges of the landing zone and into adjacent tree lines, suppressing enemy positions with rockets and minigun fire, trying to keep the enemy's heads down long enough for the slicks to get in, offload, and get out. The door gunners on the slicks themselves were firing throughout the approach once the gunship's work had cleared enough of a path to come in. You were hanging in that doorway, leaning into the machine gun, watching the ground come up as the helicopter descended toward the landing zone, and the world below you was a chaos of muzzle flash from the tree lines, smoke from the gunship rockets, dust kicked up by the rotor wash, and the terrifying orange streaks of incoming tracer rounds that told you exactly where people were shooting from and exactly how close they were coming. The most dangerous moment, the moment that every door gunner identified as the one that produced the most concentrated fear, was the landing itself. When the helicopter was in a hover over the landing zone or touching down on the skids, it was moving slowly or not at all, which meant it was the most predictable and the most vulnerable. RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades, were the most feared threat in this moment. An RPG fired at a hovering helicopter was a genuinely realistic threat. The weapon's minimum arming range was only a few meters, its warhead could defeat light armor and destroy unarmored aircraft, and at hovering speeds a trained RPG gunner had a reasonable probability of a hit. Door gunners were specifically aware of this and specifically watched for the telltale smoke trail and flash of an RPG launch, trying to engage the firer before or immediately after they launched. In this most critical moment, the door gunner's job was to fire constantly, overwhelmingly, covering every potential firing position around the landing zone with enough fire to keep the enemy suppressed while the aircraft was most vulnerable. This meant the M60 was firing essentially without pause from the time the aircraft began its final descent until it was back in the air and climbing away, which in a hot landing zone could be anywhere from 15 to 60 seconds. In those seconds, a door gunner might fire 100, 200, 300 rounds, the barrel heated with a speed that was actually visible. You could see the heat shimmer coming off the barrel in the rotor wash, and there was no time to change it, no time to do anything except hold the trigger and sweep and trust that the rounds were going somewhere useful. One veteran crew chief who transitioned to the door gunner role in 1967 described a hot LZ insertion north of Huey, during which his aircraft came in as the second slick in a formation of 6, following the lead bird into a landing zone that the enemy had clearly chosen to defend in force. The gunships had made their initial suppression runs, and the lead slick had just touched down when the tree line on the eastern edge of the LZ opened up with what he estimated as 3 or 4 AK-47s, at least one RPD light machine gun, and what sounded like it might have been a DSHK heavy machine gun somewhere further back in the woodline. He fired continuously from the approach until his aircraft lifted off, working methodically left and right across the eastern tree line. And when they were clear and climbing away, he found that he had gone through nearly his entire initial ammunition load of 1,400 rounds in a single landing. The aircraft behind his, coming in as the third slick, took a round through the tail boom that severed a hydraulic line. The pilot got it down safely in the LZ, but the helicopter was out of action until maintenance could reach it. That scenario, a single mission consuming the majority of the ammunition load, was not unusual in heavy contact operations, and it illustrates why ammunition management was such a constant preoccupation for Dr. Gunners, because the mission that started as a straightforward troop insertion could turn into a sustained engagement requiring thousands of rounds, and if you ran out before the last aircraft was clear of the LZ, you had a problem that no amount of skill or courage could solve. Running out of ammunition was not merely a tactical problem, it was a survivability problem for everyone on and around the aircraft. The gunner's fire suppressed the enemy during the aircraft's most vulnerable moments. If that fire stopped because the gun was empty, the enemy had an open window to engage the helicopter with aimed, deliberate shots, rather than the suppressed, hurried fire that a working M60 forced them into. Multiple accounts from Vietnam aviation veterans describe the specific terror of running dry at the worst possible moment, the gun clicking empty on the final belt while the aircraft was still in a hover over the LZ, the sudden awful silence from the doorway, the frantic scramble to find a linked belt somewhere, from a crew member's personal load, from the ammunition cans, from anywhere, and get it loaded and firing again before the enemy noticed and took advantage. Now, this is also the point where we need to talk in more detail about the other class of helicopter the door gunner served on, because the difference between serving on a slick and serving on a gunship was significant enough to deserve its own treatment. Slicks were primarily transport aircraft. Their job was to move people, troops, casualties, supplies. And the door gunner's role on a slick was defensive, protect the aircraft and its cargo during the transit and during the vulnerable landing and takeoff phases. Gunships were a different animal entirely. The gunship concept in Vietnam evolved through several distinct generations, an understanding that evolution explains a great deal about how helicopter tactics matured over the course of the war. In the earliest period of American helicopter involvement in Vietnam, from the early 1960s through about 1965, armed helicopters were mostly improvised affairs. Standard UH-1B utility helicopters fitted with external weapons packages that had been developed and tested in the States and then rapidly fielded in country. The XM6 system, for example, mounted 2 M60 machine guns on flexible mounts on both sides of the aircraft, plus a pair of 2.75-inch folding fin aerial rocket pods on the skid-mounted pylons. The XM16 system replaced the M6 Oats with M134 miniguns, giving a dramatic increase in firepower. These armed UH-1Bs, flying as escorts for the troop-carrying slicks, were called hogs in the aviation community. A name that, like pig for the M60, combined affection with acknowledgement of the way the heavy weapons loads made the aircraft slow and ungainly. The Hogs crew typically consisted of the aircraft commander, co-pilot, crew chief, and a door gunner. The door gunner on a Hog had a slightly different tactical role than his counterpart on a slick. Rather than purely defensive fire, he was part of an actively offensive weapons team. During gun runs, the diving attack profiles that gunship pilots use to bring their forward-firing weapons to bear on targets, the door gunner was often firing simultaneously, adding the lateral and rearward coverage that the pilot's fixed forward weapons couldn't reach. As the aircraft pulled off target and climbed away to set up for another run, the door gunner might be engaging, pursuing fire from enemy positions that the pilot couldn't see from his seat. He was, essentially, the gunship's all-aspect defensive armament, the system that covered the angles the fixed weapons couldn't. The UH-1C, the purpose-built gunship variant Bell helicopter developed specifically for the Vietnam requirement, was an attempt to address the performance limitations of trying to carry a heavy weapons load in an airframe designed as a utility transport. The UH-1C kept the basic Huey configuration but fitted a more powerful engine, the T53L13B, producing 1,400 shaft horsepower compared to the 1,100 shaft horsepower of the UH-1B, and redesigned the transmission and rotor head to handle the increased power output. It also removed all passenger carrying capacity, converting the entire fuselage into weapons and avionics space. The XM-22 weapons subsystem fitted to many UH-1C gunships included a nose-mounted XM-1 2940mm grenade launcher, two XM-159 2.75-inch rocket pods, each carrying 19 rockets, and two M60C machine guns on outboard pylons. A weapons load that gave the UH-1C substantially more firepower than the armed UH-1B configurations it replaced. But the UH-1C still had fundamental performance limitations. A helicopter carrying a full weapons load loses performance margin, and the UH-1C in hot and high conditions, the conditions that prevailed across much of the Vietnam operational environment, was sometimes marginal in its ability to maneuver aggressively during gun runs, while remaining clear of the terrain and the enemy's defensive fire. This performance gap led directly to the AH-1 Cobra, which arrived in Vietnam in 1967 and fundamentally changed the gunship equation. The AH-1 Huey Cobra was a revolutionary design. Where the UH-1 was a conventional utility helicopter that had been adapted for the gunship role, the Cobra was purpose-designed as a combat aircraft from the outset. It had a tandem-seat cockpit, with the co-pilot and weapons officer in front and the aircraft commander behind, arranged in a narrow fuselage that presented the minimum possible frontal cross-section to enemy fire, about 36 inches wide at the cockpit compared to the Huey's 8 feet of fuselage width. It had stub wings for weapons mounting that could carry a much heavier load than the skid-mounted pylons of the UH-1C, including combinations of minigun pods, grenade launchers, rocket pods, and later anti-tank missiles. Its T53-L-13 turboshaft produced enough power to give the aircraft a maximum speed of approximately 190 miles per hour in level flight, making it significantly faster than the UH-1 variants and much more capable in the aggressive maneuvering required for gun runs in contested airspace. The Cobra did not, for the most part, have door gunners in the traditional sense. Its tandem cockpit configuration didn't include crew positions in the traditional doorway locations, and the aircraft's design philosophy focused on forward-firing weapons operated by the co-pilot through a turret-mounted fire control system in the nose. The gunner observer in the front seat used a helmet-mounted sight or a sight unit to aim the nose turret's weapons, a 7.62mm minigun in early configurations, later upgraded to a 20mm cannon in some variants, providing the high-rate, precisely aimed fire that the system's electronics made possible. This was a fundamentally different conception of aerial firepower than the door gunner's M60, and it represented the direction that helicopter weapon systems would continue to evolve in, away from the exposed human gunner in the doorway and toward increasingly sophisticated, increasingly automated fire control systems that put the crew in armored cockpits and the weapons on remote-controlled mounts. But the Cobra didn't replace the door gunner. It supplemented him. The Slicks still flew, still carried troops, still needed men in the doorways to provide covering fire during insertions and extractions. The medical evacuation Hueys, the dedicated medevac ships with the Red Cross markings, still needed door guns for self-defense. Even though doctrine prohibited medevac aircraft from flying with offensive weapons, the door gun as a defensive system was retained. And in the new airmobile divisions that were the Army's premier combat formations in Vietnam, the ratio of Slicks to gunships meant that the door gunner on the Slick remained numerically the most common helicopter crew weapon position in the theatre. By 1968, at the height of American involvement, the Army was flying approximately 3,500 helicopter sorties per day across Vietnam. A significant proportion of those sorties involved Slick aircraft with door gunners. If you average even 2 door gunner positions per Slick sortie, the daily exposure of door gunners to combat conditions was running into the thousands of individual mission hours per day. Across the course of the war, the total accumulated experience of door gunners in Vietnam represented a body of human knowledge about aerial fire support, hot landing zone operations, and close-in helicopter defense that had never existed before, and would never exist in quite the same form again. The men who accumulated that experience did so at a cost that their country was slow to acknowledge and even slower to understand. But before we get to what happened to them after the war, we need to spend some more time inside the missions themselves, because the thing that made the door gunner's life what it was not any single dramatic incident, but the daily, grinding, relentless accumulation of what the job required. Now let's talk about what they were wearing, or more precisely what they weren't wearing, because the question of door gunner protection, or the almost total absence of it, is central to understanding both the courage and the casualty rate this job produced. The ideal solution to the door gunner's vulnerability would have been some form of armoured protection that could stop or deflect the rounds being fired at him. The practical problem was weight. A helicopter operates on an extremely tight weight budget. Every pound of armour plate added to the aircraft is a pound that has to be accounted for somewhere else. Less fuel, less ammunition, fewer troops, reduced range. On a UH-1 operating in the high-altitude heat of the Central Highlands, where the air density was low and the engine was already working hard just to maintain controlled flight, the weight of meaningful armour for the gunner's position was simply not available without making unacceptable trade-offs elsewhere. So Dr. Gunners flew largely unprotected. What they did have was, first, a flight helmet. This was primarily a communication device, housing the intercom system that connected the gunner to the rest of the crew, but it did provide some protection against head impacts and flying debris, and some variants offered a degree of ballistic protection against small fragments. It was not rated against rifle-caliber bullets at any realistic combat range. Second, most door gunners were issued flak jackets, the M69 body armour that was standard issue for aviation crews, which consisted of nylon ballistic cloth capable of stopping or slowing low-velocity fragments from grenades and artillery shells. It did essentially nothing against a direct rifle round travelling at 2,700 feet per second, and most veterans wore it with the resigned understanding that it was better than nothing while acknowledging that it was not very much better. The third option was the chicken plate, the informal name for the small arms protective insert, a ceramic armour plate roughly the size and shape of the breastbone area of the chest, designed to be inserted into a special vest over the flak jacket. The chicken plate was made from boron carbide ceramic, which could actually defeat rifle-caliber bullets through a ceramic fracturing mechanism. When a bullet struck the plate, the extremely hard ceramic shattered the projectile, dissipating its energy before it could penetrate to the wearer. The problem was that the chicken plate weighed approximately 3.8 pounds. Not an enormous weight on its own, but in the context of a day already spent hanging out of a helicopter in 90-degree heat and humidity, wearing a flight helmet, a flight suit, a flak jacket, and a harness system. Every additional pound was felt acutely. Many door gunners chose not to wear them, reasoning, not entirely irrationally, that in the most likely casualty scenarios the plate wouldn't help anyway, and that the weight and heat burden reduced their ability to do their job effectively. The nickname itself, chicken plate, implying that only chickens wore it, was the unit culture at work, discouraging its use through social pressure in a way that the army had not intended and probably would have preferred not to exist. Some veterans look back on that particular piece of unit culture with a degree of grimness, knowing that some of the men who chose not to wear the chicken plate were later killed by rounds that it might have stopped. Below the waist, door gunners had nothing. The lower torso, the femoral arteries in the thighs, the legs, all of it was completely unprotected. This was important because the enemy, having figured out that targeting the door gunner was a high-value action, often concentrated fire on the doorway area of incoming helicopters, and rounds that missed the upper body had a way of finding the lower half. Femoral artery wounds in combat were frequently fatal before medical intervention could be reached, and door gunners suffered significant leg and groin wound casualties as a result. The floor of the Huey's cabin was also unarmoured, which created a threat vector that wasn't always intuitive. Rounds fired from below the aircraft could penetrate the floor and injure or kill crew members from underneath. This specific vulnerability led to the improvised adoption of additional protection in some units. Crew members would stack sandbags on the cabin floor beneath their feet. Some units fitted improvised steel plate to the bottoms of their aircraft. Neither solution was ideal. The sandbags were heavy. The steel plate had to be carefully positioned and secured to avoid shifting in flight. But both were used because the alternative was sitting unprotected against rounds coming from directly below. The Viet Cong were fully aware of these vulnerabilities and specifically trained their anti-helicopter tactics around them. They understood from experience that a helicopter at altitude was difficult to hit with small arms fire. A rifle round fired at a helicopter flying at 1,500 feet had to be aimed significantly ahead of the aircraft to account for lead time, and even a well-aimed round might not hit anything critical on a machine with as many redundant systems as the Huey. But a helicopter in its most vulnerable phase, on approach to a landing zone, in the hover over it, or climbing away from it immediately after landing, was a different proposition. In these phases, the helicopter was slow, its movement was predictable, and it was close enough to the ground that even a shooter without sophisticated skills in lead shooting had a realistic chance of hitting it. The VC developed specific ambush positions for helicopter landing zones, positioning their heaviest weapons, crew-served machine guns, RPG teams, in the tree lines most favorable for engaging helicopters during their most vulnerable phases. They dug positions that provided cover from the helicopter's guns while still allowing angles of fire into the LZ. They used signal arrangements. A specific signal from a scout watching the LZ would bring up the heavier weapons just as the helicopters committed to their approach. It was a genuine tactical system, not random shooting, and it was effective. By 1967 and 1968, as the war reached its most intense period and both sides had accumulated years of operational experience, anti-helicopter tactics on the Viet Cong and NVA side had become sophisticated enough to represent a genuine strategic concern. The NVA's anti-aircraft battalions deployed man-portable anti-aircraft weapons alongside conventional small arms and were integrated into combined arms defensive positions specifically designed to contest American helicopter operations. The ZPU-1 and ZPU-4, Soviet-supplied anti-aircraft guns firing 14.5mm rounds at cyclic rates of up to 600 rounds per minute, were terrifying threats to low-flying helicopters. Even more feared was the Soviet DSHK-M heavy machine gun, firing a 12.7mm round that could damage a helicopter at ranges of 1,500 meters or more, operated by a crew capable of sustained aimed fire that was qualitatively different from the suppressive volume fire that small arms produced. When a DSHK opened up on an inbound helicopter formation, the effects were catastrophically disproportionate to the size of the weapon. Imagine yourself in that doorway as the formation comes in. The landing zone is maybe a cleared paddy a few hundred meters across with a tree line along the eastern edge that your intel assessment says is probably clear. The gunships have made one pass. Your formation is 3 aircraft. Lead, your aircraft in the trail position, and the third bird off to your left. You're 200 feet above the paddy and descending when the eastern tree line lights up. Not with the pop-pop of individual rifles, but with the hammering rhythm of a crew-served weapon, something heavier than a rifle, something with the kind of authority that sends a different message entirely. You see the tracer rounds coming up, green, which tells you everything you need to know about who's shooting, and you see where they're aimed. And they're aimed at the lead bird. The lead bird's left side door gunner is already firing back. His tracer's going red into the tree line and you're swinging your M60 around to join him, opening up before you're entirely certain of your aim, because there isn't time for certainty. There's only fire and adjustment and more fire. The landing zone is coming up. You can hear the sound of the Huey skids hitting the paddy mud before you consciously process the aircraft has landed. Troops are scrambling out the side doors, crouching low, running for the cover of the dike along the southern edge of the paddy. Your gun is still firing, sweeping left and right across the tree line. And then the pilot is pulling collective and the aircraft is lifting. And you're going nose low and fast, building airspeed, and the tree line is still shooting and you're shooting back. And at some point in that 30 seconds of noise and chaos and physical sensation, you stop being afraid because there isn't time to be afraid. There's only the gun and the tree line and the tracers and the work. That transition from terror to a kind of focused operational calm was something veterans of the door gunner role described repeatedly in different words but with consistent meaning. The anticipation was worse than the contact. The minutes on approach to a hot LZ, when you knew the shooting was coming but it hadn't started yet, when you had nothing to do but watch the tree lines and think about what was coming. That was where the fear lived. Once the shooting started, training and adrenaline took over, and you were in a state that some veterans called automatic and others called switched on, and a few described with more emotional honesty as a kind of terrifying clarity in which you perceived everything with unusual sharpness and reacted to it faster than you normally thought possible. The psychological literature on combat stress has a clinical framework for this state. It describes it as the acute stress response, the fight-or-flight mechanism operating at maximum intensity, flooding the body with adrenaline, cortisol, and norepinephrine, sharpening sensory perception and reaction time while simultaneously narrowing attention to the immediate threat. In medical terms, it's a survival mechanism that humans share with every mammal on Earth. In the language of door gunners who came back from Vietnam and tried to explain what the work had felt like, it was something that took a long time and a lot of different words to describe accurately. Most of them eventually settled on something like, "It was the most alive I've ever felt," and the most terrible. Because here is the part that never made it into the official narratives of the Vietnam Helicopter War, the part that the statistics and the unit citations and the Medal of Honor citations didn't fully capture. The door gunner's job produced a specific kind of psychological damage that was distinct from the general trauma of combat experience. The combination of factors was unusual. The frequency of combat exposure, a door gunner flew missions every single day that his aircraft was operational and the weather permitted, which in the Vietnamese rainy season could be challenging, but in the dry season meant day after day after day of missions, sometimes multiple sorties in a single day. The nature of the exposure, not the occasional firefight separated by days or weeks of patrol, but repeated, structured, daily immersion in a situation that required killing and that might at any moment result in being killed, with the specific feature that you were physically exposed and physically visible in a way that infantrymen sheltering behind cover were not, and the target recognition problem, which was perhaps the most psychologically corrosive element of all. The Viet Cong's deliberate use of the civilian population as cover and the difficulty of distinguishing combatants from non-combatants from a moving helicopter at altitude created a situation in which door gunners regularly faced an almost impossible demand: make a lethal decision about whether a human being was an enemy combatant or an innocent civilian in the space of a second or two, from an aircraft moving at speed with limited visibility through jungle and vegetation, in a country where you spoke none of the languages and understood almost nothing of the culture. The enemy had specifically designed their tactics around this difficulty. Viet Cong fighters would move through areas where civilians were present, using the civilians as a form of camouflage. They would cache weapons in civilian villages and retrieve them when needed. They used children, sometimes as young as 12 years old, as fighters, scouts, and message carriers, knowing that American soldiers were psychologically reluctant to engage child-age targets even when those targets were demonstrably hostile. The result was an environment in which door gunners regularly fired at targets they couldn't positively identify and regularly discovered afterward that the outcome was not what they had intended. Not always. Most contacts were genuine. Most of the time, the muzzle flash in the tree line really was an enemy soldier and not a farmer, but not all the time. And the cases that weren't clean, the cases where the aftermath revealed that what had seemed like a legitimate target was something else, were the cases that stayed. They didn't necessarily stay as guilt, though for some veterans they did. They sometimes stayed as a more complicated mixture of emotions that Vietnam veterans and the psychiatric professionals who worked with them struggled for decades to properly characterize. A grinding uncertainty about the nature of what had been done, a residue of images that wouldn't fade, a specific difficulty with the knowledge that you had made decisions of life and death from positions of such incomplete information that decision was almost too deliberate a word for what had actually happened. Veterans described that 90% of their missions were uneventful. Long hours of staring at uninhabited jungle, scanning tree lines that produced nothing, flying repetitive routes that became familiar to the point of boredom. And then the other 10% was something that no amount of training or preparation or experience made straightforward to process. The transition between those two states, between the numbing routine and the sudden explosive violence, was its own category of psychological strain. You couldn't maintain constant high alert for months without it extracting a serious physiological cost. But you couldn't afford to be psychologically absent when the shooting started either. The door gunners who survived and functioned over multiple deployments found their own individual strategies for managing this tension, and most of those strategies were somewhere on the spectrum between compartmentalization and dissociation, ways of putting the experience in a mental box and keeping the box closed when you weren't actively using it. Alcohol was the most common strategy, as it has been in every war. Some units had well-established drinking cultures that were tacitly accepted as part of the operational reality, on the theory that a door gunner who drank enough to sleep at night was more effective the next day than a door gunner who lay awake processing combat trauma for 6 hours. This was probably not true medically, but it was what was available, and in the absence of meaningful institutional mental health support, the Army of the mid-1960s did not have anything remotely resembling the behavioral health infrastructure it would eventually develop. It was what soldiers used. There were also the specific incidents that stood out from the general fabric of operational experience, the events that were unusual enough to be remembered in detail decades later. One young door gunner, on a mission in 1968, during which his crew had engaged what they assessed as a hostile force in a tree line, saw from the air, as the helicopter came low to assess the results, that one of the individuals they had engaged was still alive and moving. The helicopter landed in a nearby clearing to assess the situation. The door gunner, acting on an impulse he struggled afterward to fully explain, jumped out of his position without telling anyone, without telling the crew, without informing the pilot, and walked toward the wounded person. He turned around a moment later to find that the helicopter was lifting off. The crew had not realized he had gotten out. He stood in that clearing for approximately 30 minutes, alone, unarmed except for his personal sidearm, in territory that was by any reasonable assessment actively hostile, until his crew realized he was missing and returned for him. He was, as he put it in later interviews, loudly greeted by the aircraft commander. He was not court-martialed, but the incident illustrated something about the psychological state that combat produced, a kind of impulsive, unreasoned response to the sight of a wounded human being that overrode tactical common sense entirely, a reaching towards something human in a situation that had been stripped of most of the normal context of humanity. Another incident, more celebrated, involved a door gunner who fell from his helicopter during a low-altitude maneuver. The strap failed, or was inadequately secured, the exact cause was disputed in the after-action accounts, and tumbled from the aircraft at an altitude low enough that the fall, while violent, was survivable. He landed in a jungle clearing and found himself, in the first seconds of his recovery, directly on top of 2 Viet Cong soldiers who had been sheltering in the clearing. The impact knocked the wind out of everyone involved. The door gunner recovered first. He had somehow kept hold of his personal weapon in the fall. He used it, and then he waited in that clearing, alone, until his crew had figured out what had happened and returned for him. He received a formal commendation for this episode. Some of his crewmates thought this was the funniest thing they had ever heard. Some of them thought it was the most terrifying thing they had ever heard. Most thought it was both simultaneously, which in some ways describes the entire door gunner experience in Vietnam. The medical evacuation missions were different from troop insertions in their emotional character, though not necessarily in their danger. A medevac mission, flying into a hot area to extract wounded soldiers who couldn't wait for a ground evacuation, required the door gunner to perform the same fire suppression role as in any other hot LZ operation, but added the specific dimension that the cargo going onto the aircraft was your own wounded people. Veterans describe this specific combination, providing covering fire while the medic and crew chief loaded severely wounded soldiers onto the aircraft, often soldiers the crew knew personally from repeated missions to the same units, as the most emotionally demanding configuration of the job. The requirement to remain focused on the tactical task, to keep the gun working and the fire accurate, while in the peripheral vision of your awareness there was a man with catastrophic injuries being loaded 3 feet away from you, was a demand on human psychology that most people never encounter and for which most psychological frameworks had no adequate preparation. The noise of the Huey in a hover was approximately 100 decibels at the crew positions, roughly equivalent to standing next to a running chainsaw, and a sustained exposure to that noise level over months of flying produced significant hearing damage in most door gunners. Combined with the constant vibration transmitted through the floor and the door mount, the physical demands of holding a heavy machine gun in position while leaning out of the doorway, and the metabolic cost of the sustained stress response that combat produced, the physical toll of the door gunner role was considerable, even without accounting for actual combat injuries. Hearing loss was nearly universal among Vietnam helicopter veterans. Chronic back and joint problems from the vibration and the weight of the equipment were common. These were the hidden injuries, the ones that showed up years or decades after the service ended and accumulated quietly alongside the more visible psychological damage. But the psychological damage was the defining long-term consequence. And to understand its full dimensions, you have to understand the specific casualty rate that door gunners experienced. The daily structure of door gunner life at a forward operating base was a rhythm that became so familiar it created its own kind of monotony, interrupted by the specific violence of the missions themselves. You woke before dawn, usually, because the first sorties of the day launched with the light. You did your pre-flight checks, not as the pilot did his from the cockpit through the aircraft systems, but your own version. Check the mount, check the ammunition cans, check the belt feed through the weapon, check the strap. The monkey strap was always the first thing. Every morning, every mission, you check the buckle and the clip and the D-ring with your fingers, because a strap that failed in flight was something that happened, and that you could not afford to have happen to you. Veterans described the strap check as a ritual that became almost unconscious over time, performed automatically at the beginning of every flight with the same muscle memory that governed how you breathed. The unit culture of aviation companies in Vietnam was distinct from that of infantry units in ways that veterans often noted. Aviation companies were smaller than infantry battalions and more cohesive in some ways. The same crews flew together repeatedly, which built a specific kind of interdependence that infantry units, where individual soldiers might be shuffled between squads and platoons more readily, sometimes didn't develop as intensely. The crew of a Huey, pilot, co-pilot, crew chief, door gunner, flew together day after day for the duration of their tour, which typically ran 12 months. You knew your pilot's voice without having to hear his name. You knew how your co-pilot responded to incoming fire, what he did instinctively with the aircraft when rounds started coming through the fuselage. You knew your crew chief's capabilities and limitations in the way that only genuine extended operational experience can teach. And they knew yours. This intimacy of shared danger produced bonds that veterans universally described as among the most intense they ever experienced. The term brotherhood gets used a lot in discussions of combat veterans, often loosely enough that it loses some meaning. But for helicopter crews who flew together through months of combat operations, the word carried a specific weight. These were the people you trusted your life with in the most literal possible sense every single day, in a situation where the margin for error was genuinely small. When a crew member was killed, the grief was not the abstract sorrow of losing a distant colleague, but something much closer and rawer. The loss of someone whose physical presence and specific capabilities had been as much a part of your daily reality as the aircraft itself. The losses, when they came in ways that ranged from the sudden and catastrophic to the agonizingly slow. A helicopter struck by an RPG during a hot LZ insertion might come down immediately, giving everyone on board milliseconds of awareness before the impact. A helicopter taking rifle fire through a critical system might continue flying for minutes before the damage became unrecoverable, the crew aware that something was wrong, the pilot fighting to keep control, the gunner continuing to fire even as the aircraft descended. The worst scenarios were the ones where the helicopter caught fire in the air. The Huey's fuel system and hydraulic lines, if sufficiently damaged, could produce catastrophic fires that gave the crew very little time and very limited options for escape at low altitude. Door gunners were specifically vulnerable in these catastrophic failure scenarios because of their position. A door gunner secured by his monkey strap in the doorway was connected to the aircraft in a way that made rapid exit more complicated than simply jumping clear. If the aircraft was going down on fire, the gunner had to release the strap while the aircraft was potentially rolling or pitching violently, get clear of the doorway and get away from the aircraft before it hit the ground or before the fire reached the fuel tanks. In a nominal, controlled emergency landing, this was manageable. In a completely uncontrolled crash, it often wasn't. The official statistics for helicopter losses in Vietnam include all categories of loss, and their total is sobering. the Army lost 2,202 UH-1s over the course of the war, making it by far the most lost aircraft type in the theatre. Adding in other helicopter types, the CH-47 Chinook heavy-lift helicopter, the OH-6 Cayuse and OH-58 Kiowa light observation helicopters, the AH-1 Cobra, brought total rotary wing losses across all services to approximately 5,086. Of these, roughly 1,750 were lost to hostile fire rather than operational accidents. The distinction matters less than it might seem from outside the experience, because an operational accident in a combat environment, a helicopter that lost power during a mission in enemy territory, or that went down in bad weather while flying a medevac, put its crew in equally lethal danger as a hostile fire shoot-down. The crew didn't get to choose whether the cause of their crash was a bullet or a mechanical failure when they were going down in the jungle. The OH-6 Cayuse and the scouts who flew in it deserve a mention here because their experience had a specific relevance to the door gunner story. The OH-6, which the soldiers called the Loach, from its original acronym LOH for Light Observation Helicopter, was a tiny two-seat aircraft used for visual reconnaissance, flying extremely low and extremely slow over terrain where enemy forces were suspected. The scout crew consisted of a pilot and an observer, and the observer frequently sat in the open right side door with a weapon, sometimes an M60, sometimes a CAR-15 or M16, ready to engage. The Loach hunter-killer team, in which a Cobra or armed Huey orbited at medium altitude while the Loach flushed enemy forces by flying low and drawing fire, was one of the more genuinely terrifying tactical concepts in the Vietnam War. The Loach observer, dangling from an even smaller and even more fragile aircraft than the Huey, with even less protection, flying at treetop level, deliberately trying to get the enemy to shoot at him so the Cobra could identify and engage the shooter, operated under conditions that most combat veterans considered among the most demanding in the theatre. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson is perhaps the most famous helicopter crew member of the Vietnam War, though not for the reason that most aviation veterans are remembered. On March 16, 1968, Thompson was flying an OH-23 Raven observation helicopter over the village of My Lai in Quang Ngai Province when he witnessed what was in fact the massacre of hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians by soldiers of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry. Thompson landed his helicopter between American soldiers and a group of civilians they were preparing to kill, faced down the American troops, and evacuated the civilians. He reported what he had seen up his chain of command, and his report contributed eventually to the investigation that exposed the My Lai massacre. Thompson was awarded the Soldier's Medal for his actions at My Lai, though the award didn't come until 1998, 30 years after the event, after decades of official indifference and sometimes active hostility toward him for reporting what he saw. His story is in many ways emblematic of the moral complexity that the door gunner and helicopter crew experience in Vietnam encompassed. The same war that produced extraordinary individual heroism produced extraordinary individual atrocity, and the men who participated in it carried both possibilities inside them simultaneously, having to decide in real time, under the most extreme pressure imaginable, which possibility they would embody. Most did the right thing, as far as the historical record allows us to determine. Most flew their missions, did their jobs with as much skill and discipline as they could manage, protected the troops who depended on them, and came home carrying the ordinary terrible burden of having been in a terrible war. A few did not. And the presence of both within the same community of veterans complicated the homecoming in ways that added to the general difficulty of an already difficult return. The psychological aftermath of the door gunner experience also had a specifically unusual feature compared to other combat roles: the visual record. Vietnam was the most extensively photographed war in history to that point, and helicopter operations were particular subjects of photographic interest. Many door gunners found after returning home that images of their specific experience, of men in doorways, of machine guns firing, of LZ insertions, were part of the permanent cultural record of the war that they encountered repeatedly in magazines, in books, on television, in the eventual waves of Vietnam War films and documentaries. Encountering those images as a civilian in an ordinary context could be a powerfully disorienting experience, a sudden, involuntary return to the sensory reality of what it had felt like to be in that doorway, which clinical psychology would eventually recognize as a core symptom of PTSD, but which the veterans experiencing it in the early 1970s had no vocabulary for and no treatment to address. The overall casualty rate for helicopter crewmen in Vietnam was substantially higher than for the average service member deployed to the theatre. Of the approximately 12,000 helicopters that served in Vietnam over the course of American involvement, more than 5,000 were lost to all causes: combat, operational accidents, and mechanical failures combined. The loss rate for rotary wing aircraft during peak operations was higher than for any other aircraft category in the American inventory during the war. And within the helicopter crew, the door gunner was consistently identified as the crew position with the highest probability of becoming a casualty in a combat engagement, for the obvious reason that he was the most physically exposed member of the crew and the one the enemy was most specifically trying to kill first. The exact casualty figures for door gunners specifically are complicated to extract from the broader helicopter crew statistics because of the way the Army tracked losses, but credible estimates from aviation unit records and veteran accounts consistently suggest that door gunner casualty rates over the course of the war ran to a significant fraction of all personnel who served in the role. The 11th Aviation Battalion, the 101st Aviation Battalion, the 1st Aviation Brigade, and the various divisional aviation units that operated throughout Vietnam all accumulated door gunner casualty lists that represent a sobering accounting of the human cost of the role. When veterans of these units talk about the rotation of door gunners through their crews, "We had 4 different gunners in 6 months," one crew chief recalled. They're describing a casualty rate that would have been considered unsustainable in almost any other context. The Tet Offensive of 1968 was the single most intense period of helicopter operations and helicopter crew casualties in the entire war. Beginning on January 31, 1968, when Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army forces launched simultaneous coordinated attacks on more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, the scale and intensity of the fighting that followed overwhelmed every tactical assumption the Americans had been operating under. Helicopter crews flew continuously during the opening days of Tet, supporting ground forces fighting their way through urban areas they had never expected to fight in, evacuating casualties from landing zones in the middle of cities, inserting reaction forces wherever the fighting was worst. The Huey City battle alone, the recapture of the ancient imperial capital that had been seized by NVA forces and required nearly a month of brutal urban combat to retake, produced helicopter casualties at a rate that shocked even experienced aviators. In the Tet fighting, door gunners flew missions that in any previous assessment would have been considered impractical or suicidal. Direct fire support in built-up urban areas where enemy positions were in buildings that could provide cover against the door gunners' fire while offering clear angles of attack on the helicopter. Medevac flights into landing zones that were under continuous mortar and rocket fire. Sustained close-in fire support for infantry fighting through city streets where friendly and enemy forces were sometimes within grenade-throwing distance of each other, and the door gunner had to make instantaneous decisions about who was who based on uniform details and direction of fire observed at low altitude, at speed, in smoke and dust. The casualty toll from Tet set the pattern for what would become the final years of the war. A grinding, increasingly costly campaign in which American tactical air mobility remained a decisive advantage, but one that was paid for in human cost at rates the Army found difficult to publicly acknowledge. By 1969 and into 1970, as the Nixon administration began the process of Vietnamization, gradually transferring combat responsibility to the South Vietnamese forces and withdrawing American units, the tactical situation for helicopter crews began to change in character, if not necessarily in danger. American units were drawing down and ARVN units were being built up, which meant that American helicopters were increasingly flying in support of South Vietnamese ground forces rather than American infantrymen. The relationship between American door gunners and the South Vietnamese units they supported was, according to most veterans, complicated. Many South Vietnamese Army units were competent and sometimes excellent. Others were unreliable or poorly led, and the experience of flying into a hot LZ to extract troops who then refused to move was described by multiple veterans as one of the most frustrating and demoralizing things they experienced in country. The operational pace of the Vietnamization period was in some ways more demanding than the peak period of American ground combat involvement, because the number of American aviation assets was decreasing while the operational requirements remained high, Door gunners who were still in country in 1970 and 1971 were flying more missions with less support from adjacent aircraft and ground forces in an increasingly uncertain tactical environment in which NVA forces in the north were being reinforced and re-equipped with newer Soviet weapons, including improved anti-aircraft systems. The SA-7 Grail, a Soviet man-portable surface-to-air missile system provided to North Vietnamese forces beginning around 1972, introduced an entirely new category of threat to low-flying helicopters, one for which door gunners had no meaningful counter. A heat-seeking missile locked onto the Huey's turbine exhaust and launched from the shoulder of an NVA soldier in a tree line was not something that even the most accurate and alert door gunner could reliably neutralize. The missile moved faster than the eye could track. The fall of Saigon in April 1975 and the chaotic final evacuation that preceded it produced the war's final helicopter images. Images that burned themselves into the global consciousness as permanently as any from the preceding decade of conflict. The South Vietnamese civilians desperately trying to board any aircraft that would take them out. The helicopters being pushed off the decks of US Navy ships to make room for more incoming aircraft. And throughout it all, the crews, pilots, co-pilots, crew chiefs and gunners flying mission after mission during those final insane days, many of them understanding with full clarity that what they were participating in was the end of something they had given years of their lives to, and flying anyway. The last helicopter to leave the US Embassy in Saigon departed in the early morning hours of April 30th, 1975, carrying the last remaining US personnel and the flag that had flown over the embassy. It was a CH-46C Knight flown by Marine Helicopter Squadron 364, not a Huey, but the Huey, the UH-1 that had carried a generation of door gunners into combat, that had evacuated tens of thousands of wounded men, that had inserted and extracted infantrymen from thousands of landing zones across 10 years of war, was also there in those final days, flying the evacuation missions, carrying refugees out of a country that was falling around them. The men who came home from Vietnam carrying the specific experience of the door gunner role came home into a country that was, to put it mildly, not particularly interested in giving them a warm welcome. The politics of the Vietnam War had transformed public attitudes toward the military in ways that made the reception of Vietnam veterans profoundly different from what World War II veterans had received. There were no parades for the men who had flown those missions. There was, in many cases, active hostility. The famous stories of veterans being spat upon and called names that subsequent historical examination has somewhat complicated, but not entirely debunked. The more common experience, according to most veterans, was not dramatic hostility, but a kind of uncomfortable silence. The collective social decision not to discuss the war, not to examine it, not to honour the people who had fought in it. For men carrying the specific psychological load of the door gunner experience, the compound trauma of repeated combat exposure, the target recognition dilemmas, the casualty loads, the hearing damage, the accumulated weight of months of daily immersion in killing. This homecoming was catastrophic. The mental health establishment of the early and mid-1970s was not equipped to deal with what Vietnam veterans were carrying. The diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder did not formally enter the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual until 1980, which meant that for the first 5 to 10 years after the war ended, there was no clinical framework, no recognized treatment protocol, and no institutional understanding of what was happening to these men. They were told, sometimes by family members, sometimes by physicians, sometimes by the culture at large, to move on, to get over it, to come home and get on with normal life. Some managed it. Many did not, at least not cleanly or fully. Vietnam helicopter veterans, including door gunners, were significantly overrepresented in the post-war statistics on substance abuse, homelessness, suicide, and failed relationships. The divorce rate among Vietnam combat veterans was dramatically higher than for non-veterans of the same age cohort. The suicide rate, both in the immediate post-war period and over the following decades, was and remains a sobering reality. The Department of Veterans Affairs eventually developed a substantial infrastructure for treating PTSD and other combat-related psychological conditions, and millions of Vietnam veterans eventually received treatment that gave them back some measure of stability. But the early years were a period of neglect and misunderstanding that extracted its own separate toll, added on top of everything that had already been paid. By the way, there's a specific feature of the door gunner's psychological burden that's worth dwelling on for a moment because it distinguishes their experience from that of some other combat roles in subtle but important ways. The infantrymen in Vietnam experienced combat in episodes, patrols that sometimes produced contact, ambushes that erupted without warning, firefights that ended and were followed by periods of relative calm. The door gunner experienced combat in a different structure, regular, scheduled, repetitive immersion, day after day, in a situation designed around the logic of killing. You woke up, you flew, you fired your gun at human beings, you came back to base, you ate dinner, you slept, you woke up and flew again. The routine quality of this, the domestication of killing, if you want to put it starkly, created a specific kind of psychological damage that was different from the sharp, episodic trauma of the infantry firefight. It was less like being struck by lightning and more like being slowly changed by something you couldn't see clearly while it was happening to you. This is not to say that infantry veterans didn't suffer or that their experience was in any way less valid or serious. It's to say that the door gunner's experience had a specific texture that shaped its psychological consequences in ways that took decades of clinical work to properly understand. The men who flew those missions understood, even at the time, that they were being changed by the experience. Most of them wouldn't have been able to articulate it in those terms in 1968, but they felt it. The progressive emotional narrowing, the diminishing ability to feel strongly about things that had once mattered, was a common reported experience. The intrusive memories, the images that arrived, unbidden, usually at night, usually at the most inconvenient moments, began early and persisted late. The weapon itself, the M60, had its own strange afterlife in the veteran experience. Many door gunners described an intimate relationship with their gun that went beyond mere familiarity with a piece of equipment. They had named their weapons, maintained them with a care that bordered on devotion, developed deep personal confidence in their individual gun's specific characteristics. After the war, when the gun was gone and they were home, some of them found that they missed it in a way they couldn't quite explain to people who hadn't carried one. Not because they wanted to be shooting it, but because it had been the fixed centre of their professional identity during an extraordinary period of their lives, and its absence was part of the general displacement of coming home. The legacy of the Vietnam door gunner in military history is both specific and diffuse. In the specific sense, the tactics, techniques, and procedures they developed, through trial and error, through improvisation, through the accumulated operational experience of 10 years of combat, became the foundation for how every subsequent generation of American military helicopter crews approached the door gun mission. The Army's Aviation Center and School at Fort Rucker, Alabama, which had been the institutional home of Army helicopter training since 1954, codified the lessons of Vietnam into formal doctrine that shaped the helicopter crews who flew in Grenada, Panama, the Gulf War, Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The fundamental challenges that Vietnam door gunners grappled with: how to fire accurately from a moving platform, how to manage ammunition in sustained engagements, how to protect the aircraft during its most vulnerable phases, how to coordinate between the aircraft's crew in the chaos of a hot LZ, are still the challenges that helicopter door gunners grapple with today, solved now with better equipment, but confronted with the same human reality. The M60 itself went through multiple iterations after Vietnam. The M60E3, introduced in 1986, addressed many of the reliability and handling problems of the original design, adding a new bipod, a universal sling configuration, improved barrel change procedures, and a lighter pistol grip. The M60E4, which followed in 1994, further refined the design, adding an improved feed system and other reliability upgrades. The M60E6, the most current production variant, incorporates lessons learned from decades of operational use and remains in service with Special Operations Forces and other specialized units. In the door gun role specifically, it has increasingly been supplemented or replaced by the M240, a Belgian-designed general-purpose machine gun that the US Army adopted in the 1990s and which offers superior reliability and slightly better ballistic performance through its heavier barrel profile at the cost of some additional weight. But the M60 is still out there. It's still flying in some configurations. It's still doing the job. The UH-1, the Huey, similarly refused to retire gracefully. The type remained in active US military service until the early 2000s in some roles, and in reserve and National Guard units somewhat longer. Foreign military sales distributed the Huey to dozens of nations around the world, and many of those export customers continued flying them well into the 21st century. In 2019, the Huey became the first American military aircraft to fly for 60 consecutive years in US military service, a record unlikely to be surpassed. The specific sound of its two-bladed rotor, different from the higher frequency sound of later helicopters, a deeper, more pronounced thwop-thwop that was distinctive enough to be recognizable as a Huey and nothing else at distances of miles, became one of the most recognizable sounds in modern military history. It carries with it an enormous weight of association. The newsreels, the photographs, the films, the veteran memories. It is the sound of that war. In 2017, the Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association estimated that approximately 10,000 of the 40,000 men who flew as helicopter pilots and crew members in Vietnam were still alive. The numbers have declined since then. The men who flew the door guns, the young men, most of them teenagers when they started, who hung in those open doorways and held those machine guns and swept those tree lines and brought those helicopters back again and again until sometimes they didn't, are in their 70s now, the survivors of them. They carry what they carry. Some of them have told their stories to historians and documentarians and simply to younger family members who ask the right questions. Some of them never have and never will. There is a particular wall in Washington, D.C., black granite, angled into the earth, engraved with 58,220 names. That includes, among those names, the door gunners who didn't come back. They are not separately categorized, not distinguished from the pilots and infantry and artillerymen and all the other categories of American dead whose names are cut into that stone. The wall doesn't explain how each of them died or what they were doing when it happened or how old they were or whether they were afraid. It just holds the names. What it means to stand in front of that wall, to run your finger along the letters of a specific name and understand that behind that name is a man who sat in the doorway of a Huey with a machine gun in his lap and flew into fire again and again until one day the fire won. That meaning cannot be compressed into a statistic or captured in a document. What you can say, honestly and simply, is that the men who took that job understood what it was and did it anyway. They went up every day knowing the risks were real, knowing the enemy was specifically targeting them, knowing the protection they had was inadequate and the mission was harder than it looked from the outside. They were not superhuman. They were afraid. The ones who survived and were willing to talk about it almost universally acknowledged the fear, the sustained, chronic, difficult fear that came not from a single dramatic moment, but from the daily requirement to go back into a situation that experience had taught them was genuinely dangerous. And they went back anyway, because their crew depended on them, because the infantrymen on the ground depended on them, because the wounded soldier in the hot landing zone who needed to be lifted out depended on them, because that was the job, and they had chosen to do the job, and they did it. Vietnam is often discussed as a war defined by its ambiguities, strategic, political, moral, and it was all of those things. But in the doorway of a Huey at 100 feet above the jungle, none of those ambiguities were the immediate reality. The immediate reality was the gun, the tree line, the incoming fire, the man next to you on the aircraft who needed you to keep doing your job. That reality was completely clear. It was almost everything else, before it and after it, that was complicated. The concept of the aerial gunner, the man who puts himself at the edge of a flying machine with a weapon in hand to engage an enemy below, is old enough to trace back to the observers who leaned out of World War I reconnaissance aircraft and fired pistols and rifles at German aircraft passing nearby. It evolved through the gunners of World War II bombers who sat in glass turrets at 30,000 feet and traded fire with Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. It found its most intimate, most exposed, most human expression in the jungles of Vietnam, where a man with no armour and a machine gun hung in an open doorway 60 feet above the enemy and stared down the barrel and fired. The technology has changed enormously in the decades since. The optics, the communications, the weapon systems, the aircraft themselves have all been transformed beyond recognition. But the fundamental human requirement hasn't changed. Someone has to be at the edge, exposed, looking down, deciding. That requirement is still being met in different aircraft over different terrain in different wars by people doing a job that is as old as military aviation and as specific as Vietnam, and carrying the weight of both. The institutional memory of the door gunner experience was preserved through several channels that, over time, built a surprisingly rich historical record. The Vietnam Helicopter Crew Members Association, founded by veterans who recognized the importance of documenting their specific experience before the generation that lived it, was gone. Gathered oral histories, operational records, unit citations, and personal accounts that form one of the most complete archives of any specific combat role from the Vietnam War. The Museum of Aviation at Warner Robins, Georgia, and the Army Aviation Museum at Fort Rucker, Alabama, preserve aircraft, equipment, and documentary records from the period. The Virtual Vietnam Archive at Texas Tech University holds millions of documents from the war, including unit after-action reports, casualty statistics, and operational records that allow researchers to reconstruct in considerable detail what specific aviation units did on specific days in specific areas of Vietnam. But the most important preservers of the experience were the veterans themselves, the ones who found, in the decades after the war, that they wanted to tell the story, wanted to make sure it was known and understood, and not reduced to the political abstractions that the Vietnam War so often became in public discourse. Many of them had been reluctant to talk in the years immediately after the war, partly from the cultural pressure not to, partly from their own complicated feelings about what they had experienced, partly from the accurate assessment that most of the people around them had no reference point from which to understand what they were describing. But over time, particularly as the mental health consequences of combat experience became better understood, and as the culture began slowly to separate its assessment of the war from its assessment of the people who had fought in it, more and more of them began to speak. The stories they told are the record. Not the statistics, not the unit designations, not the tables of aircraft losses and sortie counts. The record is what it felt like to fly that mission and come back, and then fly it again the next day. The record is the name of the crew chief you flew with for 7 months, and what he said the last morning you saw him before his crew went out on a mission it didn't come back from. The record is the sound of the Huey's rotor in the dark before dawn when you were walking out to the aircraft with your helmet and your coffee and your gun, and knowing with complete clarity what the day was going to require of you, and going out anyway. There is also the question of what the door gunner's experience contributed to the subsequent evolution of aerial warfare, because the answer to that question is more than most people realize. The close air support doctrine that American forces developed and refined through decades of post-Vietnam experience, the integration of rotary wing aircraft with ground forces, the tactical procedures for hot LZ operations, the crew coordination standards for helicopter combat operations, all of it traces directly back to the lessons learned through painful experience in Vietnam. The Aviation Center at Fort Rucker produced training programs, tactical manuals, and doctrinal publications in the years after Vietnam that translated the collective operational experience of thousands of helicopter crews into codified knowledge that could be taught to subsequent generations. The specific innovations in crew resource management that became standard in aviation safety, the explicit communication protocols between crew members during critical phases of flight, the authority gradient between pilot and crew that allows junior crew members to speak up about safety concerns, the formal brief and debrief structure that captures lessons learned from each mission. Many of these trace back to problems that were identified and worked on during Vietnam, sometimes after accidents that should not have happened but did because crew coordination was inadequate. The door gunner was part of this evolution, his role in the crew communication structure, his specific responsibilities during approach and landing and egress from the LZ, his authority to call out threats and direct the aircraft's response to them. All of this was formalized and codified in ways that made every subsequent generation of helicopter crews more effective and safer. The wars that followed Vietnam tested these lessons in new contexts. In Grenada in 1983, the first significant post-Vietnam use of Army helicopter forces in combat, the limitations of the Huey-era doctrine against modern air defenses were exposed sharply. Several helicopters were lost to anti-aircraft fire, and the lessons about helicopter vulnerability to increasingly capable ground-based air defense systems accelerated the development of both better aircraft and better tactics. In Panama in 1989, the Army applied its refined doctrine in a more successful template. In the Gulf War of 1990 and 1991, the helicopter, now exemplified by the AH-64 Apache rather than the Huey, a quantum leap in performance and weapons capability, was used in ways that would have been unimaginable in Vietnam. The AH-64s that flew the first combat missions of Operation Desert Storm, attacking Iraqi air defense radar sites to open a corridor for the subsequent air campaign, flew in ways that reflected 30 years of doctrinal evolution that began in the jungles of Southeast Asia. In Somalia in 1993, the experience that became the basis for the book and film Black Hawk Down produced a moment that brought the helicopter crew experience back into the public consciousness in a visceral way. The Battle of Mogadishu on October 3rd and 4th involved a complex helicopter assault that went catastrophically wrong when two MH-60 Black Hawk helicopters were shot down by RPG fire over the city, and the effort to reach and protect the crash sites turned into an overnight urban battle that cost 18 American lives and produced numerous acts of extraordinary heroism. The door gunners of the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, the Army's elite aviation unit, flew through conditions that recalled the worst of Vietnam's hot LZ operations. Sustained automatic weapons fire, RPGs from multiple directions, wounded crew members, aircraft that continued flying after taking damage that should have been fatal. The door gunner tradition, evolved and refined across 30 years since Vietnam, was visible in Mogadishu in the most fundamental terms, and in Iraq and Afghanistan, in the wars that defined the first decade and a half of the 21st century, helicopter crews, including door gunners, flew hundreds of thousands of combat sorties over terrain, as varied as the mountains of Kuna Province and the urban streets of Fallujah. The technology had advanced enormously: night vision systems, digital communication, GPS navigation, sophisticated threat warning systems, helicopter designs with genuine armor and survivability systems built in from the drawing board. But the fundamental human requirement remained the same. Someone had to be in the doorway. Someone had to be watching the ground. Someone had to be ready to fire. The door gunner of 2005 or 2010, flying a UH-60 Black Hawk in Afghanistan, was separated from his Vietnam predecessor by 40 years of technological development, doctrinal evolution, and institutional learning. He had a night vision system mounted to his helmet that let him see in complete darkness. He had a communications suite that connected him to every other aircraft and ground element in the operational area with a clarity and reliability that 1968-era radio equipment couldn't approach. His weapon, typically the M240 general-purpose machine gun, or sometimes an upgraded M60 variant, or in some configurations the GAU-17 minigun, was more reliable and in some ways more capable than what Vietnam door gunners had used. But he hung in the doorway in the same fundamental relationship to the aircraft and the ground and the enemy as his predecessor, working the same essential tension between firepower and exposure, making the same kinds of rapid, imperfect, consequential decisions about where to point his gun and when to fire. The name that connected all of them, Vietnam door gunner, Gulf War crew chief with an M60, Black Hawk crew member in Afghanistan, was not the name of a unit or a weapon system or a military occupational specialty. It was something more informal and more enduring than any of those designations. It was the simple fact of the doorway and the gun and the ground rushing past below, and the awareness, never entirely absent, of what it cost to be the one who stayed in that doorway and kept firing when everything below was trying to stop you. In the end, what the door gunners of Vietnam gave the military, apart from the blood they paid and the tactical knowledge they accumulated, was a proof of concept that endured. They proved that a man in a helicopter doorway with a machine gun could provide a form of fire support that nothing else could replicate. They proved that this role could be filled reliably and effectively by young men with relatively limited prior training, given sufficient instruction in the specific demands of the job and the specific challenges of the environment. And they proved, at great cost and over many years, what the limits and vulnerabilities of that approach were, lessons that shaped every subsequent effort to make the door gun position safer, more effective, and more survivable. It is not a story that ends cleanly. There is no victory to celebrate, no enemy finally defeated, no moment of resolution that wraps the entire experience in a satisfying conclusion. The war ended badly for the cause the door gunners had been fighting for, and many of them spent years reconciling themselves to that outcome with varying degrees of success. Some never could, but the experience itself, what they did, how they did it, what it cost them, and what they learned, is not diminished by the political outcome of the war. That experience belongs to history now, to the record of what humans do to each other and for each other when the circumstances demand it. If you ever stand near an old Huey in a museum, and there are many of them preserved more than you'd expect, spread across aviation museums and military installations from Fort Rucker to the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir, take a moment to look at the doorway. Look at the space where the door gunner sat. The door has usually been removed for display purposes, which means you can see straight through to the outside, see the open air where the gun mount would have been, see the floor where the ammunition cans were stacked, and the gunner's feet would have been braced against whatever surface he could find purchase on. It is a small space, smaller than you'd imagine, and that small space, repeated across thousands of aircraft and thousands of missions over 10 years of war, was where some of the darkest and most human stories of the Vietnam War were lived. The men who lived in those doorways looked out at a war from a perspective that nobody else shared. Suspended between the aircraft and the earth, between flight and combat, between the mechanical certainty of the gun in their hands and the impossible human uncertainty of everything the gun was pointed at. They were the ones who hung at the edge and held the line as long as they could. Some of them are still here to tell you about it. And the ones who aren't, their names are on the wall, in letters cut into black granite, as permanent as anything in Washington, waiting for the next person who comes and stands in front of them and tries to understand what it means.